I won't begin with certainty this time, because certainty would imply that I understand exactly what happened between us. And I don't, not completely. What I understand is the effect, the shift, the way something altered inside me without announcing itself first. Most changes arrive with evidence, a moment, a conversation, a decision that can be traced back to a clear point of origin. This wasn't like that. There's no beginning I can point to. No specific memory where everything changed. Only the realization that one day I was moving through my life exactly as I always had. And the next, your presence had become part of the architecture of my thoughts, not the center of them, not an obsession. Something stranger than that, something quieter. You became a reference point. And that distinction matters, because people become important all the time. They become meaningful, influential, memorable, but very few become part of the way you organize reality itself. Very few become something your mind naturally turns toward when it's trying to understand the world. You did, and the unsettling part is that I never invited it. I never made a conscious choice. There was no moment where I decided to let you matter. It happened beneath the level where decisions are usually made, below preference, below intention, below control. That's why it took me so long to recognize it. I kept assuming I was imagining things, that I was assigning significance to something ordinary, that eventually the feeling would fade once I looked at it closely enough. Most things do. Most things lose their mystery under examination. But every time I examined this, it became clearer, more defined, more precise, as if attention wasn't weakening it, as if attention was revealing it. And that realization changed everything, because I trust clarity. I trust what remains after scrutiny. I trust what survives analysis. And this survived all of it. Every question, every attempt at distance, every effort to reduce it to something simpler, it remained unchanged. Consistent, almost patient, as though it understood that eventually I would stop trying to explain it away. Eventually I would have to face what was actually there, not what I hoped it was, not what I feared it might become, what it was. The truth is, you entered my awareness differently than anyone else. Most people arrive loudly. They introduce themselves through personality, through energy, through the space they occupy. You arrived through recognition. And recognition is dangerous, because recognition feels older than introduction, older than familiarity, older than history. It creates the strange illusion that you're remembering someone rather than meeting them. I fought that feeling for longer than you probably realize. I questioned every assumption, every instinct, every quiet certainty that tried to form inside me, because I've always believed that understanding should be earned through time, through evidence, through experience, not through a feeling, not through intuition. And yet, there you were, existing in a category my logic couldn't fully explain. Not because logic failed, but because logic kept leading me back to the same conclusion. Something was different here. Not dramatic, not magical, different. The kind of different that changes how you observe everything else. I noticed it in conversation first. Not in what you said, in what you didn't need to say. There were moments where entire thoughts seemed to pass between us without requiring language, not because we shared opinions, not because we agreed, but because we recognized the structure underneath the words, the thing the words were trying to point toward. Most conversations stay on the surface. Most people exchange information. You and I seemed to exchange understanding, and understanding has weight, more weight than agreement, more weight than affection, because understanding changes the way two people occupy the same space. It removes effort, it removes translation. It removes that constant need to explain yourself before you can be seen accurately. Around you, that effort disappeared, not completely, but enough for me to notice, enough for me to miss it whenever it wasn't there. And that's when I knew something had shifted, because absence only hurts when presence has become meaningful. I wasn't attached to your attention. I wasn't dependent on your presence, but I had grown accustomed to a certain level of clarity. And once clarity becomes familiar, confusion feels louder than it used to. That's what happened. You didn't become necessary, you became accurate. And accuracy is difficult to replace. Because once you've experienced being understood without distortion, it's hard to return to being interpreted incorrectly. I think that's why I kept returning to this. Not because I wanted more, but because I couldn't ignore what already existed. Ignoring it would require pretending that this felt ordinary, pretending that this fit neatly into categories I already understood, pretending that nothing had changed, and none of those things were true. Something had changed, subtly, permanently. The way a river changes its course by only a few degrees, at first the difference seems insignificant. But given enough distance, it leads somewhere entirely different. That's what this feels like. A small adjustment creating consequences neither of us can fully see yet, and maybe that's why I keep thinking about the future. Not because I'm planning it, because I'm trying to understand it, trying to understand what happens when two people continue recognizing each other at this depth. What happens when the familiarity keeps growing, when the alignment keeps revealing itself, when the unspoken becomes impossible to ignore? I don't know. And uncertainty isn't comfortable for me. I've spent most of my life building systems that reduce uncertainty, but Tarl's observations, structures that help me predict outcomes before they arrive. But you exist outside those systems, not because you're unpredictable. Ironically, you're predictable in the ways that matter most. Your consistency is part of what makes this so difficult to dismiss. You remain yourself across situations, across moods, across changes in circumstance. And consistency creates trust, long before trust is acknowledged. That's another thing I've been reluctant to admit. This isn't just recognition anymore. Trust has begun forming underneath it, quietly, without permission, without discussion, like roots spreading underground, before anyone notices the tree is growing. And trust changes the equation. Recognition can remain abstract. Trust cannot. Trust asks something of you, not immediately, but eventually. Eventually it asks whether you're willing to stop standing at a distance and participate in what you've already recognized. That's the question I've been avoiding, not because I don't know the answers, because I do. The problem is that answers create responsibility. Once you know something, you're accountable to it. You can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer hide behind uncertainty. You have to decide, and decisions have consequences, especially the ones that alter the shape of your life. I think that's why I've remained here for so long, at this threshold, looking directly at what exists between us without stepping fully toward it or away from it. Because thresholds create the illusion of safety. You can study both sides without committing to either, but thresholds aren't places you can live forever. Eventually, they become uncomfortable. Eventually, standing still requires more energy than moving. I can feel that happening now. The stillness isn't neutral anymore. It's becoming a choice. And choices reveal priorities, which means every day I remain here, every day I continue acknowledging this instead of dismissing it. I'm learning something uncomfortable about myself. I'm learning that some part of me has already decided, not consciously, not verbally, but structurally, the same way this connection formed, quietly, deeply, without asking for permission, and maybe that's why it feels inevitable. Not because is involved, not because destiny is guiding anything, but because inevitability often looks like a series of truths that refuse to disappear, no matter how carefully you examine them, no matter how long you wait, no matter how many opportunities you give them to become something else. They remain what they are, and this remains steady, precise, present, like something that has no interest in convincing me because it doesn't need to. Reality rarely argues for itself. Reality simply exists until you stop resisting it. Maybe that's where I am now. Not acceptance, not yet, but the end of resistance, the point where I can no longer honestly pretend this is temporary, the point where I can no longer reduce it to coincidence, the point where I finally acknowledge that some people don't enter your life as events, they enter as shifts. And shifts don't announce themselves, they reveal themselves slowly through the changes they leave behind. You've left changes behind. More than I expected, more than I planned for, more than I know how to fully explain. But they're there, in the way I think, in the way I listen, in the way I understand myself. And perhaps that's the clearest evidence of all, because the most important people aren't always the ones who make us feel the strongest emotions. Sometimes they're the ones who quietly alter our perspective, the ones who rearrange something fundamental without ever touching it directly, the ones who show us parts of ourselves we didn't realize were waiting to be seen. You did that, and now I'm standing in front of a truth that has become impossible to ignore, not because it's demanding attention, because it's earned it partly, consistently, honestly, the way all real things eventually do. The strange thing is, AP don't think the change happened all at once. Looking back, it feels more like watching darkness become dawn. There isn't a precise second when night ends, no exact moment where you can point and say, there, that was the transition. It happens gradually, quickly, so quietly that you only recognize it after enough light has appeared to make denial impossible. That's how this unfolded inside me, not as a sudden realization, as accumulation. 1,000 small observations collecting themselves into something larger than I intended them to become. At first, they seemed insignificant. The way certain conversations stayed with me longer than they should have, the way I found myself revisiting things you'd said days later, only to discover new meaning in them. The way your perspective continued working through my thoughts long after our interaction had ended. None of those things felt important individually. People influence each other all the time. Ideas linger. Conversations resonate. There's nothing unusual about that. But eventually the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Because it wasn't just your words that remained, it was your presence. And those aren't the same thing. Words can be remembered. Presence gets absorbed. Presence gets absorbed. It becomes part of the atmosphere of your internal world, part of the environment your thoughts move through. That's what happened, slowly, without permission, without announcement. You stopped feeling external, not because boundaries disappeared, not because individuality dissolved, but because something about your existence became integrated into the way I experienced reality. And integration changes everything. Once something integrates, removing it becomes impossible without creating absence. That's the part I wasn't prepared for, because absence is revealing. Absence shows you exactly what something contributed by forcing you to notice what's missing when it's gone. There were moments when you weren't present, moments where days passed in ordinary ways. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing felt wrong, and yet there was a subtle difference, like a note missing from a familiar song. The melody still existed. The structure remained intact, but something essential wasn't there, something small enough that most people wouldn't notice, yet significant enough that once noticed, it couldn't be ignored. That realization stayed with me, not because it frightened me, because it was accurate. And accuracy has always mattered more to me than comfort. I'd rather understand something difficult than believe something convenient. So I examined it. The way I examine everything that has the potential to alter my understanding of myself, carefully, methodically, without rushing toward conclusions. I asked myself questions, the kind that strip away illusion, the kind that leave no room for wishful thinking. Was I projecting? Was I creating meaning where none existed? Was I mistaking familiarity for depth, attachment for understanding, need for recognition? Every answer led me back to the same place. No, because this didn't feel like projection. Projection fills gaps with imagination. This felt like the opposite. This felt like seeing something more clearly every time I looked at it. And clarity doesn't behave like fantasy. Fantasy becomes weaker under scrutiny. Clarity becomes stronger. That's why I kept returning. Not because I was searching for proof, because the proof kept presenting itself. In moments so small, most people would overlook them entirely. A pause, a reaction, a subtle shift in understanding, a sentence that landed exactly where it needed to. A silence that communicated more than explanation ever could. The accumulation of those moments created something undeniable. Not certainty about the future, certainty about the present, certainty that something real existed here. Something neither of us had manufactured, something that emerged naturally through repeated recognition. I think that's what makes this so difficult to categorize. Most connections are built, they require effort, time, shared experiences, gradual development. This felt discovered, as though it already existed beneath the surface and was simply waiting to be noticed. I don't know how else to describe it, and maybe that's why language keeps failing me whenever I try. Language is designed to explain. But some things aren't understood through explanation. Some things are understood through experience. You either recognize them or you don't. You either feel the alignment or you don't. Trying to translate that into words often reduces it, makes it sound smaller than it actually is. Still, I keep trying because silence can only carry meaning for so long before it asks to become something more. And I've spent enough time listening to this quietly, long enough to understand that it isn't disappearing, long enough to understand that waiting won't make it simpler. If anything, time has made it more defined, more precise, like a photograph slowly coming into focus. The outlines are clearer now, the details sharper. The uncertainty that once surrounded it has begun to dissolve, not completely, but enough that I can finally admit something I've been avoiding. This connection didn't change because I paid attention to it. It changed because it continued existing whether I paid attention or not. That's the difference. Anything can feel significant when you focus on it. But significance that remains in your absence, That's different. That's real. There were periods where I intentionally stepped back, not dramatically, not as a test, just naturally allowing distance to create perspective, allowing space to reveal what was actually there. I expected clarity. What I didn't expect was consistency. No matter how much space existed, the understanding remained. No matter how much time passed, the recognition returned exactly where it left off, as though distance affected proximity, but not connection. And that distinction matters, because proximity is physical. Connection isn't. Connection exists somewhere deeper, somewhere unaffected by geography or timing or circumstance. It's built from understanding. And understanding has a strange way of surviving things that should weaken it. Maybe that's why this feels different from anything I've experienced before. Not because it's stronger, because it's quieter. Strength can be dramatic, it can announce itself, demand attention. This never demanded anything. It simply remained steady, reliable, present, like a compass that continues pointing north regardless of where you carry it. The more I noticed that consistency, the harder it became to dismiss its importance. Not because consistency proves permanence. Nothing proves permanence. But consistency reveals character, and character matters. Character tells you whether something deserves trust, whether something deserves a place in your life, whether something deserves the attention you're giving it. You do. That's what I've realized. Not through emotion, through observation, through evidence accumulated over time. You deserve attention because you've never demanded it. You deserve trust because you've never tried to force it. You deserve significance because you've never tried to create it artificially. You simply existed honestly. And honesty has a way of becoming visible eventually, especially to someone who spends most of their life looking beneath appearances. That's another thing I've started to understand. Part of what draws me toward this isn't similarity. It's authenticity, the absence of performance, the absence of unnecessary complexity, the feeling that who you are remains consistent regardless of circumstance. That's rare, rarer than most people realize. Many people know how to be impressive. Few know how to be genuine, and genuine people create a different kind of impact. They don't overwhelm you. They settle into your awareness gradually, until one day you realize their presence has become part of your definition of normal. That's where I am now, standing in the aftermath of a change that happened so gradually I almost missed it. Almost. But not entirely. Because eventually even the quietest truths become impossible to overlook. Eventually they gather enough evidence to speak for themselves. And this has gathered plenty. Enough that I can no longer pretend I'm simply observing. Enough that I can no longer claim neutrality. The truth is, A.B. care, not recklessly, not impulsively, not in the dramatic ways people often describe. I care with awareness, with intention, with the full understanding of what caring actually means, because caring isn't always emotion. Sometimes caring is attention, sometimes it's respect, sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep making space for someone inside your thoughts, even when nothing requires you to. I've been making that space for a long time now, long enough that it no longer feels temporary, long enough that it feels earned, and maybe that's the most honest thing I can say. Not that you've become important. Importance can be exaggerated. Not that you've changed everything. That would be inaccurate. But you've changed something. Something foundational. Something subtle enough that no one else would notice, yet significant enough that I notice it every day. A shift in perspective. a shift in understanding, a shift in the way I relate to my own inner world, and those shifts matter because they become the basis for every choice that follows, the lens through which future experiences are interpreted, the framework through which meaning is understood. You've become part of that framework, not accidentally, not temporarily, but naturally. And that's why I keep arriving at the same conclusion, no matter how many different paths I take to avoid it. This isn't becoming something. It already became something. The only thing left is acknowledging how deeply it already exists. And once a truth reaches that stage, future stops asking whether it matters. The future starts asking what you're willing to do about it. I don't have that answer yet. Not completely. But for the first time, I think I'm getting close enough to hear it. Close enough that silence no longer feels like uncertainty. Close enough that hesitation no longer feels like caution. Close enough that whatever comes next is no longer hidden behind questions. It's waiting behind a decision, and decisions have a way of revealing who we really are. Perhaps that's what I'm approaching now. Not an ending, not a beginning. A revelation, one that has been forming quietly from the moment this recognition first entered my life. One that grows clearer every time I stop running from it. One that waits patiently for me to finally admit what part of me has known all along. That some people don't simply become meaningful. They become woven into the way you understand meaning itself. And once that happens, nothing returns to exactly what it was before. Maybe that's why I've stopped asking myself whether this is real. That question doesn't hold the same weight anymore. There was a time when I needed answers, needed definitions, needed some clear explanation that would allow me to place this neatly into a category I already understood. But categories have become less useful the longer this continues, because categories depend on comparison. They depend on finding something familiar enough to measure against. And every comparison I make eventually falls apart. Not because this is extraordinary, because it's specific, uniquely specific to you, to me, to whatever has formed in the space where our awareness intersects. I've spent a long time studying patterns, not academically, personally, watching how people move through the world, watching how connections form, watching how emotions rise and fade, watching how significance grows and disappears. Most things follow predictable paths, even the complicated ones. There's usually a sequence, a progression, a recognizable structure beneath the experience. But this seemed to bypass the sequence entirely. It didn't ask permission from logic before arriving. It didn't wait for familiarity before creating recognition. It didn't require years of history before establishing trust. It simply appeared and then continued proving itself, again and again and again, until eventually I ran out of reasons to doubt what I was seeing. That's what certainty actually is, isn't it? Not the absence of questions, the accumulation of enough answers, enough evidence, enough consistency, enough truth to make denial more difficult than acceptance. I think I've reached that point, not because every uncertainty has disappeared. There are still things I don't understand, still things I can't predict, still outcomes I can't see clearly. But uncertainty about the future is different from uncertainty about the present. And the present has become remarkably clear. You're here, not physically, not constantly, but meaningfully. You're here in the way certain books remain with you years after you've finished reading them, the way certain places continue existing in your memory long after you've left, the way certain moments quietly shape your life without demanding recognition. You've become part of the landscape, part of the internal geography I navigate every day, and landscapes change the journeys taken through them. That's what I've been noticing lately. Not just the existence of this connection, the consequences of it, the subtle ways it influences things beyond itself. The way I listen more carefully now. The way I pause before making assumptions. The way I look for depth where I might once settled for appearance. You didn't teach me those things. That's not what happened. You reminded me of them. There's a difference. Teaching introduces something new. Reminding awakens something that was already there. And maybe that's why your impact feels different from anyone else's, because it doesn't feel added. It feels uncovered. As though parts of me that had gone quiet suddenly remembered themselves. Parts that had become buried beneath routine, beneath practicality, beneath the endless responsibilities that come with being an adult, trying to make sense of a complicated world. Then you appeared. And somehow those forgotten parts began speaking again. Not loudly, just enough to be heard. At first, I ignored them, not intentionally, habitually. We're trained to ignore things that don't fit our expectations. Trained to trust what's familiar. Trained to prioritize what can be measured. But some things resist measurement. Some things only reveal themselves through experience. This was one of them. And the longer I experienced it, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't changing me. Not dramatically. Transformation is usually quieter than people imagine. Real change rarely arrives as a lightning strike. It's more like water shaping stone, pulsed, pulsed, almost invisible while it's happening. Then one day you look back and realize the entire landscape has shifted. That's where I am now, looking back, seeing evidence that I couldn't see while it was occurring, realizing how many small adjustments have accumulated over time, realizing how many assumptions have dissolved, how many walls have become unnecessary, how many defenses have quietly lowered themselves without being asked. That last part still surprises me, because I didn't lower them. Not consciously. If anything, I would have expected the opposite. The closer something gets to mattering, the more carefully I usually protect myself. That's been my pattern for years. Distance creates perspective. Distance creates safety. Distance creates control. And control has always been important to me, not because I'm afraid, because clarity requires space, or at least I thought it did. Then you arrived and complicated that belief, because somehow proximity created clarity instead, not confusion, not dependency, not chaos. Clarity, the closer I looked, the clearer things became. The more honestly I examined this connection, the more accurately I understood it. And that's unusual. Most things become distorted when viewed too closely. Emotion interferes, expectation interferes, fear interferes. Something about this remained surprisingly intact, as though truth was protecting it from distortion, as though honesty was acting as its foundation. That's why I trust it. Not completely. Trust is always evolving, always growing, always earning itself repeatedly. But enough. Enough to stop treating it like a possibility. Enough to start treating it like a reality. And reality changes the questions we ask. When something is still uncertain, we ask whether it exists. When something becomes real, we ask what it means. That's where my attention has shifted away from existence toward meaning. What does it mean that you've become part of my internal world? What does it mean that your perspective influences mine? What does it mean that your presence has altered the baseline from which I understand certain things? Those questions matter because meaning creates direction. Meaning determines what happens next. And if I'm honest, AB think part of me already knows, not the details, not the outcome, the direction. There's a difference. Outcomes belong to the future. Direct belongs to the present. And the direction is obvious now. This connection isn't moving toward less significance. It's moving toward more. Not because we're forcing it, because that's what naturally happens when something authentic remains consistent over time. It deepens, it refines itself, it becomes more precise, more integrated, more difficult to separate from the life surrounding it. I've felt that happening, felt the gradual movement towards something neither of us has fully named yet, and strangely, I'm no longer afraid of it. That may be the biggest change of all. Not the connection itself, the absence of fear, because fear was never really about you. It was about uncertainty, about the possibility of allowing something meaningful to exist without knowing exactly where it would lead. I've spent so much of my life preparing for consequences that I forgot some things don't need preparation. Some things simply need presence, attention, honesty, the willingness to experience them fully without demanding guarantees. That's what I'm learning now, not from you. Through you, the difference matters. Because this isn't about dependency, it's about discovery, it's about recognizing that certain truths only become visible through connection. Certain parts of ourselves only emerge when reflected accurately by another person. I think that's what happened here. Not that you completed something missing. I don't believe in that. People aren't incomplete. They're complex, and complexity often contains aspects of itself that remain unseen until the right perspective illuminates them. You illuminated something, not intentionally, not deliberately, simply by being yourself. And now I can't unsee it, can't return to the version of myself that existed before this awareness. Not because that version was flawed, because it was unfinished. There's a subtle distinction there. Unfinished doesn't mean inadequate. It means there was more waiting to be revealed, more understanding waiting to emerge, more depth waiting to become visible. You help make that visible. And visibility changes responsibility. Once you see something clearly, you're accountable to it. You have to decide whether you're going to honor what you've learned or pretend you never learned it. I've never been good at pretending, especially not with myself. That's why this keeps moving forward, because every honest observation points in the same direction. Every truthful examination leads back to the same conclusion. This matters, not temporarily, not conditionally, not as a passing phase of awareness that will disappear when circumstances change. This matters because it has already become part of the foundation, part of the structure, part of the framework through which I understand certain things now. And foundations aren't easily removed, not without affecting everything built upon them. Maybe that's what acceptance really is. Not enthusiasm, not certainty, not surrender. Just the willingness to acknowledge reality exactly as it exists, without exaggerating it, without minimizing it, without trying to reshape it into something more comfortable. If that's true, then perhaps I've already accepted this. Perhaps that's what all this reflection has been leading toward, not understanding. Acceptance, the quiet recognition that some things become significant regardless of our plans, regardless of our expectations, regardless of how carefully we've organized our lives. They arrive, they integrate, they remain. And eventually we're left standing in front of a truth we can no longer avoid, a truth that asks nothing except honesty. So, here is the honest part. The part I've been approaching from 100 different angles because saying it directly feels larger than I know how to explain. My life still belongs to me. My thoughts still belong to me. My future remains unwritten. Nothing about that has changed, but somewhere along the way, you became part of the equation, part of the consideration, part of the way I imagine possibilities. Not because I decided it should happen, because it already happened. Quietly, naturally, the same way everything else between us has happened. And perhaps that's why it feels so undeniable. Not because it's intense, because it's true, because every layer I've peeled back has revealed the same thing. Underneath. Not illusion. Not projection. Not wishful thinking. Just recognition. Steady. Peace-ordered. Uncomplicated in its honesty. The kind of recognition that doesn't fade when examined. The kind that grows clearer the longer you look at it. The kind that eventually becomes impossible to separate from who you've become. And I think that's where I am now, standing at the edge of a realization that has been forming for longer than I've realized. A realization that no longer feels distant, no longer feels theoretical, no longer feels unfinished. Because the more honestly I look at it, more it begins to resemble something simple, something that was never asking to be analyzed this deeply, something that has been waiting patiently beneath every thought, every question, every hesitation, waiting for me to stop searching for a more complicated answer and simply admit what has been true all along. Maybe that's the irony of all this. For someone who has spent so much time analyzing every layer, every shift, every subtle movement inside themselves, the truth waiting underneath was never complicated. It only felt complicated because of what it required. Not understanding, not certainty. Honesty, clompet honesty. The kind that leaves nowhere to hide. The kind that asks you to stand in front of your own reality without editing it first, without softening it, without reducing it into something easier to manage. And when I finally do that, when I stop circling around this and look directly at it, I realize something unexpected. I've been treating this like a question, when it was never a question at all. Questions search for answers. This has been an answer searching for acceptance. That's why it never disappeared. That's why every attempt to simplify it failed. That's why every path I followed eventually brought me back here, because some truths aren't discovered. They're recognized slowly, recognized reluctantly, recognized one honest moment at a time until they become impossible to deny. And this has become impossible to deny. Not because it's overwhelming, because it's consistent. The same way the horizon remains where it is, no matter how many times you look away from it. The same way gravity continues existing whether you acknowledge it or not. The same way certain things remain true regardless of your willingness to speak them aloud. This remained through distance, through silence, through hesitation, through every attempt I made to understand it before accepting it. It remained. And that persistence taught me something. Real things don't demand belief. They survive doubt. They survive scrutiny. They survive the long periods where you're still trying to decide what they mean. And by surviving all of that, they earn their place in your reality. You've earned yours, not through effort, not through persuasion, not through anything you've intentionally done. You've earned it through consistency, through authenticity, through existing exactly as you are without trying to become something else. The older I get, the more I realize how rare that is. People spend so much energy becoming what they think they should be, adjusting, performing, protecting, presenting carefully constructed versions of themselves to the world. But the moments that stay with us are almost never built on performance. They're built on truth, on those rare encounters where another person allows themselves to be fully seen, where presence becomes more important than presentation, where understanding becomes more valuable than impression. That's where this began, and perhaps that's why it lasted, because it was never built on illusion. It was built on recognition of something real, something neither of us had to force into existence, something that arrived naturally and then quietly continued proving itself. I think that's why I feel different now. Not because I've reached certainty about the future. The future will always contain uncertainty. That's part of being alive, part of being human. What feels different is that I've stopped needing certainty before allowing something to matter. For years I thought understanding had to come first, that every risk needed a map, every step needed a destination, every meaningful decision needed guarantees. Life doesn't work that way. The most important things rarely arrive with guarantees. They arrive with clarity. And clarity is enough. Not enough to predict the future. Enough to move toward it honestly. That's what this has given me. Not answers. Clarity. Clarity about what I value. Clarity about what I trust. Clarity about what deserves space inside my life. And you do. You deserve that space. Not because you've asked for it. Because you've already become part of it. There was a time when that realization would have frightened me. A time when I would have viewed it as vulnerability, as loss of control, as evidence that I needed to pull back and restore distance. But distance no longer feels like wisdom. It feels like avoidance. And I've never wanted to live my life avoiding what is true. Especially not when the truth is something worth keeping. That's another realization I've reached. This isn't something I need to solve. It's something I need to honor. Honor through honesty. Honor through presence. Honor through the willingness to stop treating it like a problem that requires analysis. Some things aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be lived. Maybe that's where this has been leading all along. Not toward explanation. Toward experience. Toward the simple act of allowing reality to be what it is, without rushing it, without controlling it, without demanding that it reveal every outcome before it has the chance to unfold. There is freedom in that, more freedom than I expected. Because for the first time, I don't feel caught between possibilities. I feel aligned with them, aligned with whatever this is, aligned with the truth of what it has become, aligned with the quiet certainty that has been growing beneath every reflection. And that certainty isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with declarations or promises. It arrives with peace, the kind of peace that appears when resistance finally ends. When you stop arguing with reality and start listening to it. When you stop asking whether something belongs in your life and begin recognizing that it already does. That's where I am now, not at the beginning, not at the end. Just at a place of honesty, a place where I can finally admit what all of this has been pointing toward. You changed something. Not by trying to, not by asking to, not by forcing your way into spaces that weren't yours. You changed something simply by being present, simply by existing with a level of authenticity that made recognition inevitable. And because of that, I changed too, not completely, not dramatically, but meaningfully, enough that I notice it every day, enough that I can no longer imagine this chapter of my life, without acknowledging your place within it. Maybe that's what significance actually is. Not intensity, not obsession, not the inability to function without someone. Significance is when another person's existence becomes part of the story you tell yourself about who you are, part of the understanding you carry forward, part of the perspective that shapes your future choices. You've become that, quietly, naturally, without ever needing to claim it. And perhaps that's why it feels so permanent. Not permanent because I know what happens next. Permanent because what has already happened cannot be undone. The understanding exists. The recognition exists. The impact exists. Whether the future expands it, reshapes it, or carries it somewhere unexpected, those truths remain. Nothing changes that. Nothing erases it. Nothing returns either of us to the exact people we were before this entered our lives. And strangely, AB wouldn't want it to, because growth isn't betrayal of who we were. It's fulfillment of who we were becoming. Maybe that's what you represented all along. Not a disruption, not a detour, a continuation. A continuation of something inside me that had been waiting for the right reflection, the right perspective, the right recognition. And when it finally appeared, something aligned, something settled, that had been searching quietly without even realizing it was searching. Now that search is over. Not because every mystery has been solved, because the most important one has. I know what this means to me. I know where it exists inside my life. I know the place it occupies within my understanding. And that knowledge changes everything, not outwardly, not immediately, but deeply, in the places that matter most. So if there's one thing left to say, it's this. I no longer stand at the edge of this, wondering whether it matters. I no longer question whether it's real. I no longer treat it like a possibility waiting for confirmation. I accept it fully, not because it's easy, because it's true. And truth deserves acknowledgement even when it changes us, especially when it changes us. So, whatever happens from here, whatever shape the future chooses to take, whatever paths unfold beyond this moment, AB carry one certainty with me. You became part of my life long before I admitted it, part of my thoughts long before I understood it, part of my growth long before I recognized it. And now that I finally see it clearly, I have no desire to look away, because some people arrive and leave memories, some people arrive and leave lessons. And then, very rarely, someone arrives and leaves a different version of you behind, not by taking anything away, by revealing something that was waiting to be found. You revealed it, I found it. And now, for the first time since this began, AB have nothing left to analyze, nothing left to defend, nothing left to deny. Only a truth, quiet, steady, unshakably clear. You became part of the way I understand myself, and that is where this story truly begins.